Hello and welcome to Hot Topic. I'm Hugh Riches. Andrew de Freitas has been on North East Lincolnshire Council, or its ancestors, since 1969. In 2003, he led the Liberal Democrats into coalition with the Conservatives, a precursor to national politics. After elections a year later, he took over as leader and remained in office until 2009. The coalition collapsed and he just survived a vote of no confidence after the council invested £7 million in what proved to be unsound Icelandic banks. He's now the elder statesman in a Liberal group of only 4 councillors, and he's been the Liberal parliamentary candidate in every general election since 1997. Andrew de Freitas, welcome.
You're welcome.
Should we start just being a little bit historical and going back to those Icelandic banks? Did it not seem like an offer that was too good to be true?
Well, yes, I mean, you really need to look at the background of it, because for the period that we had money in Icelandic banks and other banks, the council had earned interest to the tune of just over 10 million. I think it was a tragic error on behalf of some very senior officers who were supposed to have kept the eye on the ball, didn't take enough notice of the warnings that had been mentioned to the local authority, and I think it was a tragic error. But as far as monitoring the council's investments, there has been little change since those days. In fact, to a large extent, it's always monitored by a team of officials within the local authority. And North East Lincolnshire was not exceptional.
No.
I think there were something like 90-odd public bodies.
It's no better if everybody else suffered the same thing, though.
I accept that. I mean, we are fortunate that we've got almost all the money back from the failed banks in Iceland.
Since then, you have left office. So you've left the leadership of the council as consequences of the rolling elections of North East Lincolnshire Council.
Yes.
You did have 19 seats, the Liberal group, at one point. Yes. You now have 4. The last elections in 2000.
In fact, we've got 3.
You've got 3. Oh dear, I'm sorry.
No.
Has something happened?
No problem. Well, only in the last 6 months. Yeah.
Okay.
We had a defection.
Well, that's a very Cold War sort of word to use. But your vote has gone down massively as well, from 5,310 to only 3,634 votes in the whole of North East Lincolnshire for the Liberal Democrats at the last local elections. Why are the Liberal Democrats doing so badly, so suddenly in the last few years?
Well, in the last few years, obviously we went into coalition, the government, with the Conservative Party nationally. And I think the Tories have been very clever. When anything goes wrong, they tend to blame the Liberal Democrats. And much of the good stuff that's actually come from the coalition government has been policies that the Liberals have insisted should be implemented. For example, a lot of people have been taken out of tax altogether, the low paid.
Yes, but that's a very conservative policy, isn't it?
No, it certainly isn't. I think you will find it was very much at the insistence of the Liberals in the coalition that we have to do something for the low pay.
But Nick Clegg, to go to national politics for a moment, and you've been a national politician in that you've been a candidate for Parliament. Nick Clegg has become almost a figure of scorn. He's broken promises, for which he very politely apologised, on higher education funding, and his such ideals as the Liberal Party has, and liberalism itself, seems to have been compromised to a big brother Conservative Party. And is that not why they've become unpopular? Because nobody thinks that the Liberals will be able to achieve a liberal agenda.
No. With respects, I think the issue with the tuition fees, certainly it was a main policy within the Liberal Democrats that we should do something for the students. But if you're in a coalition with any other party, it's obvious you cannot insist that all your policies should be adopted. It's impossible to have that situation when you've got a hung parliament. And that's precisely what you had. So the Tories had to give way on lots and lots of issues their manifesto had been substantially amended in government. Likewise, we had to give up some of the very treasured policies that we had that we felt was important. The Green Agenda, for example, I think you've got very much a lot of progress on green issues which you would not have had if you didn't have Liberal Democrats involved in the coalition government.
Well,
the Tories had to give way on many, many issues.
One central Liberal policy has been to introduce proportional representation and change the voting system for Parliament in this country. In the agreement with the Conservative Party, the Conservatives agreed to a referendum which was held in 2011 on whether or not to change the electoral system to proportional representation, in return for which the Tories expected Liberal support for a redrawing of the boundaries of constituencies so that the constituencies would be more likely to have the same number of people in them, so that we're all represented, each MP is representing the same number of people, and that's greater democracy. You had your referendum for proportional representation in 2011. You lost it by 68 to 32%, 68 to 32% of the vote, and yet you still won't agree. The Liberal Party still won't agree to a boundary change which would increase the democratic representativeness of our members of Parliament.
Well, if I may say this, there certainly was an agreement on that. But in that agreement, the Prime Minister and his colleagues did not make it clear that once the referendum was called, they would then actively campaign against changing the voting system. And that's the issue. As far as I'm concerned, we were very honourable when there was an agreement. But what the Tories did not say is that once the referendum was called, they would then campaign actively against a change in the voting system. And indeed, they even produced literature attacking Nick Clegg, highlighting the man as having broken the promise on education on the student fees. And that, quite frankly, was disgraceful. They didn't stick to their side of the deal.
Perhaps
that is why in Parliament we made it quite clear we wouldn't support the Tories on the boundary changes that they were proposing.
You were taken by surprise by politicians who chose to campaign on an issue. Now that
because there's certain principles.
You're punishing them by not agreeing to a boundary change which makes Britain a more democratic country. It's an old Chartist claim that all constituencies should have about the same number of people in them. If you have some constituency with many people, each one of those is less well represented by its one MP. So you're rather punishing the idea of democracy because you think the Tories welched on a deal and everybody else who's hoping for any democracy is suffering from it.
Equally, you can argue that in a genuine democracy, PR is a much better system to the system you've got, where it is possible to get 30% of the national vote and end up with no members of Parliament whatsoever. What sort of a democracy is that?
But there's it's an imperfect democracy, first past the post, but it would be more perfect with equal constituencies. Now, you're saying that it would be much better to have, of course you think it's much better to have proportional representation. The Liberals would do much better.
No. On a matter of fundamental principle of what democracy is supposed to mean, one man, one vote of equal value. Now, I can tell you a little bit about my history. Where I was born, incidentally, the British government suspended the constitution.
I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to stop you for a commercial break there, Andrew De Freitas. I'm so sorry, and I want to know about that history because that's very informative.
No.
But we'll come back to that in a moment.
Will do.
For the moment, I'm so sorry, exactly the wrong moment. No. But for the moment, we're going to have to take a break. We'll stop there, but we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew De Freitas, leader of the Liberal Democrat group in North East Lincolnshire Council. Is there much point in providing opposition to the present Labour group in administration in North East Lincolnshire, because all they're doing is obeying effectively central government commands and trying to find their £80 million of cuts over the next few years? they're really powerless. They're just doing what they're told by Westminster, aren't they?
Well, to some extent I would agree with you on that, and you may find that unusual being a member of the opposition, but I think when you have opposition you also need to have responsible opposition. My view on it is, of course, unfortunately, when people come into the centre of Grimsby and they see all the crazy paving schemes that's being rolled out, they start to question how much money has this local authority got and whether they're spending it wisely. I know the argument will be it's capital spending, it therefore comes from a separate pot, and largely some of that comes from taxpayers, not from council taxpayers, taxes that are collected nationally. But still, it's very difficult to understand why money should be wasted. And the view of the public is a lot of the present paving schemes that you see being rolled out around the centre of the town, is a lot of it is being wasted.
And is that, I mean,
and that's a matter, I mean, I've had a go at the leader about it. It's a matter of taste, but the majority of people find it very poor taste. I do think there is a big issue too, that if you just concrete everything in sight around the centre of town, you get rid of all the shrubbery, all the trees, well, it becomes a very boring landscape and not very good for the environment.
The Labour administration would say that the money, most of the money spent on all those the crazy paving, herringbone effects and some of that town centre development is money that did come from central government and wouldn't have come into the borough at all were it not for that. That money didn't cost the budget anything at all. That was extra money.
Well, I think you'll find that some of it and some of the money being spent will come from local resources as well. But it's an interesting debate, and it's a question I do think about taste and what is right for our borough. And I would maintain that we need to introduce a little bit more greenery into the landscape, more so when you see what's happening in some parts of the country, where we create these massive concreted areas. When the sky's open and it rains, where does it go? Straight into the drains. You know, we need to be thinking well ahead and to start changing our views of what we do about our environment. And I think it's so stark. At times I get the feeling as if maybe I'm in North Korea. You know?
It's quite that bad.
I find it very, very boring and horrendous.
But you had 5 years of leader of the council, and you didn't introduce more greenery or more drainage or create a more environmentally friendly atmosphere. These are good criticisms you make, but you've had your chance.
Yeah, but with respects, I think the first few years that we had charge of this local authority, we had to address a very, very serious financial problem. We had inherited a situation, us and the Conservatives in coalition inherited a situation where the local authority had no balances. We had to rebuild the balances. In recent months we were criticised by the current leader of the council for having to do so. But a lot of that was done with the assistance and help from a Labour government who recognised that North East Lincolnshire was in financial chaos 12 years ago. That was recognised. And we had to rebuild the capital resources because we didn't have any money.
But the present regime also has a dreadful financial crisis. It has to make these £80 million cuts in the next few years.
Yeah.
Would you do it any differently to the way they're doing it?
No, in fact, I mean, this is one of the difficulties that I've had and the criticism that I make of the coalition. It would have been better to have had a Liberal actually as Secretary of State for Communities. I think he would have been much more understanding because Liberals tend to be much more they're attached to the grassroots, local communities. I think, unfortunately, Mr. Pickles has been a total disaster.
I didn't mean really if you were doing it differently from the point of view of central government, but if under the conditions that we have now, you were in power in North East Lincolnshire, and you were leader, would you be cutting in any way differently to the cuts that are being made by the present administration?
In answer to that question, I would say probably yes. Yes. But to actually identify specific areas under the circumstances, because it is tough for local government. And I think there is a danger that if central government keeps cutting the support grant they give to the local authority, and it isn't just North East Lincolnshire, it's other local authorities in particular in the northern part of England, I think it will kill off local government altogether. And there's no way you can run the whole of the United Kingdom and all the local services and what that entails, working with communities from Whitehall. You just can't do it. And I'm hoping that, you know, certainly the next settlement from central government would be a vast improvement on what we've had this term round and what we've had in recent years.
Well, the present administration is still muddling along. It's going to lose jobs, it's got to make these cuts, and it has raised council tax. But after 4 years without a raise in council tax, it's rising it by a surprisingly small percentage, 1.9%.
Yes.
Perhaps one of the Liberal policies might have been to raise council tax by more than that.
Well, no, I mean, we had great difficulty in certainly in the last 3 or 4 years. But the decision was made that we would freeze the council tax because of the support central government was giving it. But I think it's fair to say that the way things are going with local government, it's almost on its knees currently. And to go on reducing substantially the budget of the local authority will have a disastrous impact on services, and in particular the frontline services. And it's very, very difficult to protect the current services. I think to freeze the council tax for a 5th year running would be very, very difficult indeed. Having said that, you know, I have to speak to my colleagues. The council meeting is coming up shortly, and we will make a decision whether we support what the current administration is doing or whether we vote with the opposition against that budget.
More cheerfully than taxation, perhaps, there is the future of North East Lincolnshire seems to depend on renewable energy and that whole new industry coming in here.
Yes.
And presumably you in the Liberal group would encourage that inward investment and do what you can to encourage large-scale industry here.
Yes, of course.
One of the issues that's coming up is that Able wishes to build a wind farm servicing facility on the south bank of the Humber near Immingham, and Associated British Ports doesn't want to give them the land. How do you resolve that?
Well, I think both parties, ABP and Able, need to get together and resolve the issue, because it's very much in the interest of the whole of the south bank of the Humber to have that development and that diversification along the Humber bank. Make no secret of the fact that I've always supported the manufacture of turbines and wind energy. It's certainly in the interest of our environment, and this area has tremendous potential in that particular field.
It certainly does. One final question before we have to stop. Will you be standing for Parliament again in 2015?
The answer to that is I do not know at this stage. I have to think about it.
Thank you very much for watching. Please join me
You're welcome.
again for next week's Hot Topic. Goodbye.